Okay, so you're ready for another deep dive, right? We're tackling a huge topic this time, other than Moses himself.
The man, the myth, the legend, and the lasting legacy, right?
Precisely. To get a solid grasp on all that, we've got two fascinating books to dissect. Richard J. Bernstein's Freud and The Legacy of Moses.
And Jan Assmann's Moses the Egyptian.
So we're bringing together psychoanalysis and cultural history, two very different lenses, to see what they reveal about Moses, monotheism, and how they still shape our world.
And we're going deep, going chapter by chapter to give you the core of each author's argument.
Exactly. No extra fluff, just the good stuff. No long introductions, just straight to the meat of the matter.
Sounds like a plan?
All right, let's kick things off with Bernstein's book. He really digs into Freud's The Man Moses and the monotheistic religion. And right from the get-go, Bernstein highlights Freud's lifelong fascination with Moses.
Yeah, it was almost an obsession, especially towards the end of Freud's life.
Absolutely. And what makes this even more intriguing is the historical context.
Right.
I mean, Freud published this book right before the Holocaust.
Just a horrific period in history for Jewish people.
Yet in the midst of that, he puts forth these, well, Bernstein calls them scandalous claims about Moses.
Like suggesting Moses was actually Egyptian.
And even more provocative, that he was killed by the Israelites themselves.
Yeah. So the question that immediately jumps out is, why? Why would Freud publish such a controversial and seemingly unfounded theory at that particular moment?
And that's precisely the central question Bernstein grapples with throughout his book.
His core argument is that, despite all the controversy and even the offense it caused, Freud was genuinely trying to use the man Moses to answer a fundamental question.
Which is?
The essential nature of being a Jew. Bernstein believes that's what Freud was wrestling with.
I see. So he's essentially saying that this wasn't just some random theory. It was an attempt to get at the heart of Jewish identity.
Exactly. And it's crucial to understand Bernstein's approach here. He's very meticulous in sticking to Freud's actual claims and arguments within the book. He's not trying to psychoanalyze Freud himself, which is something other commentators have done.
He's not trying to read between the lines or speculate about Freud's hidden motives.
Right. He wants us to first understand what Freud explicitly says.
Fair enough. So how does Freud even begin to tackle this question of Jewish identity through the figure of Moses?
Well, he starts by looking at the work of Otto Rank, specifically Rank's observations on the myth of the birth of the hero.
Ah, yes, I remember that. Rank noticed all these common threads in the origin stories of heroes across cultures and time periods.
Exactly. Whether it's national heroes, religious founders, or even mythical figures, there are these recurring patterns in their narratives.
Right, like often the hero is born into nobility.
But there's some difficulty around their conception or birth.
Sometimes the father tries to get rid of the child.
There's a miraculous rescue, often by ordinary people.
And the hero is raised in obscurity, unaware of their true parentage.
Until, of course, they eventually discover their true identity.
Which often leads them to seek revenge against the father figure.
And finally, they achieve some form of greatness.
It's amazing how consistent these patterns are. But what did Freud make of it?
Well, Freud, being Freud, saw the family romance at play. He believed those unconscious fantasies we have as children about our parents and our place in the family were the root of these hero myths.
These poetic fictions, as he called them.
Right. And this brings us to Freud's more controversial claims, the ones that Bernstein labels as scandalous.
The Egyptian origin of monotheism and the murder of Moses.
Exactly. And Bernstein emphasizes that Freud genuinely believed that if Moses was Egyptian, it would completely change our understanding of the origins and nature of monotheism and the Jewish religion itself.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how did Freud try to support this theory?
Well, one of his key pieces of evidence was circumcision. He points to Herodotus and archaeological evidence that shows that circumcision was a very long-standing tradition in Egypt.
But not among other groups in the Eastern Mediterranean like the Semites.
Exactly. Even the Bible itself, if you look closely, suggests that the Canaanites weren't circumcised. So Freud's logic here is pretty interesting. He asks, why would a Jewish Moses, someone trying to establish a distinct identity for his people, impose an Egyptian practice on them?
Especially one that would constantly remind them of their time in slavery.
Right. It wouldn't make much sense. So Freud concludes that if Moses brought circumcision to the Jews, he must have been Egyptian himself.
And the religion he introduced likely had Egyptian roots.
Potentially tied to Akhenaten's Eton religion, which, as you know, was this short-lived but radical moment of monotheism in Egyptian history.
Right. Okay, so that's the circumcision argument. What else did Freud use to support this idea of Moses being Egyptian?
Well, Bernstein points out how Freud used this concept of entstellung, which has this fascinating double meaning. It means to alter the appearance of something, to disguise it, but it also means to displace something, to move it from its original place.
Interesting.
And Freud compares this to a murder, saying the real challenge isn't the killing itself, but getting rid of the body, erasing all the traces.
Oh, I see. So he's suggesting that even if direct historical evidence seems to vanish, the impact of those suppressed events can resurface in different ways,
Right.
like a hidden truth that keeps popping up in unexpected places.
Exactly. So even if we don't have clear historical proof of Moses's Egyptian origins, Freud would argue that the traces, the impact, might be found elsewhere, like in the specific characteristics of Mosaic monotheism.
Right, okay, I'm following you. So Freud had this idea about Moses' Egyptian origins, but how did he connect that to the Jewish people of his time? How did he tie it to this question of Jewish identity?
That's what he explores in the final part of his book. He starts by describing the Jewish religion attributed to Moses as this incredibly strict monotheism. One God, all-powerful, unapproachable, no images allowed, even the name considered too sacred to utter.
Right, but wouldn't that seem to contradict his theory? I mean, how could this rigid monotheism evolve from what he saw as primitive Egyptian polytheism, the kind that existed before Akhenaten?
That's precisely the obstacle Freud faced. The contrast seemed too stark, too sudden. But then, in 1922, Ernst Sellin made this crucial discovery.
Tell me about it.
He found evidence, clues in the prophet Hosea dating back to the 8th century BCE of a tradition that suggested Moses met a violent end. And not just that, his own people, the Israelites, were responsible. They killed him and rejected his religion.
Wow. And this wasn't just some isolated mention. Bernstein details how this tradition reappears in later prophets and, according to Sellin, even becomes the basis for certain messianic expectations.
Right, so this discovery gave Freud the missing piece of the puzzle.
I see. So how did Freud tie this into his theory about Moses?
Well, he drew a parallel with Akhenaten. Remember, Akhenaten also used force to try and impose his beliefs, his version of monotheism, on the Egyptian people.
And Freud saw both Moses, who he believed was influenced by Akhenaten's ideas, and Akhenaten himself as these enlightened despots.
Their religions were highly spiritualized, but ultimately their people couldn't accept them.
While the Egyptians simply waited for Akhenaten to die, Freud suggests that the savage Semites, as he called them, took matters into their own hands with Moses.
It's a pretty dark and disturbing interpretation, but it fit with Freud's overall view of human nature and the role of aggression in shaping civilizations.
Yeah, it definitely paints a bleak picture. But before we delve deeper into Freud's reconstruction of events, Bernstein takes a detour to examine Freud's initial hesitation to publish this work.
Right. Freud actually envisioned the man Moses as a three-part project. The first part was meant to be more novelistic, a bit more engaging for a general audience. The second part was more academic, more scholarly. But the third part...
That's where things got tricky.
Yes. That's where he planned to really lay out his theory of religion. And that's what made him hesitate.
He was worried about the reaction.
Big time. Especially considering the political climate in Vienna at the time. It was a very Catholic city, and Freud had already stirred up controversy with totem and taboo. He was worried about alienating people, the uninitiated, as he called them, with these radical ideas about religion.
I see. And was there anyone in particular he was concerned about?
Yes, Peter Schmidt, a very influential scholar close to the Pope and a staunch opponent of psychoanalysis.
Ah, I remember reading about him. He argued that psychoanalysis was a Jewish science and tried to discredit it within the Catholic Church.
Exactly. And Freud feared that publishing Moses and Monotheism could lead to a ban on psychoanalysis in Vienna. He was worried about his colleagues, their ability to practice and publish.
So he held back for a while, weighing the risks.
He did, but eventually he decided to publish.
Okay, so back to Freud's theory. How did he piece together the events, starting with this idea of Moses being Egyptian?
So, in Freud's interpretation, Moses, being Egyptian, chose the Semites in Egypt, whom he saw as less advanced, to be the carriers of Akhenaten's monotheism. This would have been after Akhenaten died and Egypt had returned to polytheism.
Okay, so Moses is trying to preserve this monotheistic flame, so to speak. But why choose the Semites, a group that had been enslaved by the Egyptians?
Freud suggests that it was precisely because they were seen as less advanced. He believed Moses saw an opportunity to elevate them, to give them a distinct identity.
And how did circumcision fit into all of this?
Well, according to Freud, Moses introduced circumcision, which he believed was an established Egyptian practice, as a way to prevent the Semites from feeling inferior. He essentially elevated them to the same level, ritually speaking, as the Egyptians.
Interesting. Okay, so then we have the Exodus. But how did Freud view that event? Was it simply a liberation from slavery?
It was more than that. Freud saw it as a move to establish a new kingdom, a new nation, based on this monotheistic religion inherited from Akhenaten.
A kind of religious utopia in the wilderness.
Exactly. But as you might expect, things didn't go as planned. The strictness of this new religion, the demands it placed on the people, led to rebellion.
And ultimately, the murder of Moses.
Sadly, yes. And this is where Freud's interpretation gets really interesting. He believed the immediate reaction to Moses' death was a return to polytheism.
Makes sense. If the figure who imposed monotheism is gone.
The people might revert back to their old ways, but Freud suggests that later on, at a place called Kadesh, these Egyptian Semites encountered other tribes who worshipped a deity named Yahweh.
Yahweh, wasn't that a volcanic deity associated with fire and power?
Precisely. And Freud argued that this fusion, the blending of the original Egyptian monotheism with this Midianite Yahweh worship, laid the foundation for what would eventually become Judaism.
So it's not a purely Egyptian origin story, but a hybrid one.
Right, and this is where Bernstein brings up Freud's concept of Fortschritt in der Geistigkeit, which translates to advance in intellectuality.
I remember reading about that. It's Freud's idea that the prohibition against graven images in Jewish law, a concept he considered profoundly significant, actually spurred intellectual development.
He argued that it forced the Jewish people to focus on abstract thought, on ideas rather than physical representations.
Which in turn boosted their self-esteem and encouraged them to value intellectual pursuits. It's fascinating how Freud ties a specific religious prohibition to this idea of intellectual progress within the Jewish tradition.
Right. And he goes even further, suggesting that when the nation faced political hardship, like the destruction of the temple, they turned to their literature, their Torah, for solace and strength.
This intellectual focus became a key unifying force for the Jewish people, especially when they were scattered and without a homeland.
Right. And a great example of this is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai establishing the Torah school at Jabna after the temple's destruction. He essentially shifted the focus from the physical temple to the intellectual and spiritual world of the Torah.
Right, that's a crucial moment in Jewish history. Bernstein also delves into how Freud distinguished between tradition and the written record. He saw a potential for divergence, where oral tradition might preserve aspects of the past that were left out of, or even contradicted, the official written accounts.
Freud viewed tradition as both a supplement to and a contradiction of historical writing. On one hand, it could be more truthful, less subject to deliberate distortions since it was passed down through generations, but on the other hand, it was less reliable, more prone to change and embellishment over time.
So it's a double-edged sword. And what did Freud think about the fate of these oral traditions?
He considered several possibilities. They could be overshadowed by writing, eventually fading into obscurity, or they could be written down themselves, becoming part of the official record. And of course, there were other possibilities, like merging with other traditions or evolving into something entirely new.
This all reminds me of the telephone game, how stories can change as they're passed from person to person.
It's a great analogy. And this brings us to one of Freud's more complex ideas, the inheritance of memory traces. Bernstein points out that Freud was actually quite critical of his own earlier assumptions about this.
He had initially taken for granted that we could inherit memories, independent of direct communication. But then he started to have doubts.
Exactly. He recognized the difficulty in separating traditions that were passed down through these unconscious memory traces from those that were transmitted through direct communication, like stories or teachings.
So the big question for him became, how are these unconscious memory traces of external events, these echoes of the past, present in our archaic heritage? How are they passed down through generations?
And Bernstein emphasizes that we shouldn't misunderstand Freud here.
No.
He wasn't suggesting that specific traumas were somehow encoded in our genes, like some kind of Lamarckian inheritance.
Right, that's a common misconception.
Instead, Freud was interested in the psychological mechanisms of transmission, how these unconscious memories of past events, even collective traumas, could shape the course of history, particularly Jewish history.
Okay, so we've got Freud's view on tradition, this complex interplay of memory traces and direct communication. But Bernstein doesn't stop there. He brings in another perspective, Gadamer's.
Gadamer, a prominent philosopher, argued that traditions are already a part of us, woven into the fabric of our being, before we even consciously recognize them.
So it's not something we choose to accept or reject. It's already there, shaping our understanding of the world.
Precisely. And Gadamer also critiques the Enlightenment's negative view of prejudice. He argues that some prejudgments, those inherited through tradition, are actually essential for understanding the world. They provide a framework, a starting point for interpretation.
So it's not all bad.
Not necessarily. And Gadamer sees tradition not as some dead weight from the past, but as something living, evolving through ongoing dialogue and reinterpretation.
It's not blind obedience to the past, but a critical engagement with it, a claim to knowledge that works alongside reason.
Right, and he talks about a fusion of horizons when we engage with tradition. It's not just the past, but the past in relation to the present and even the future.
I like that. Okay, so we've got these different views of tradition, but how does all this relate to Freud's main argument about Moses and monotheism?
Well, Bernstein then explores Freud's take on eternal truth, historical truth, and material truth, particularly in the context of religious beliefs.
Okay, so the devout believer might see the lasting impact of monotheism as evidence of an eternal truth being revealed.
Right. But Freud, ever the skeptic, had his doubts. He thought the pious argument rested on this overly optimistic assumption that the human mind is naturally inclined to gravitate towards truth.
When in reality, we're often susceptible to wishful thinking and self-deception.
Exactly. However, Freud does concede that this pious solution contains a kind of truth, what he calls the historical truth, though not necessarily the material truth.
So what's the difference?
Well, Bernstein points out the inherent instability of Freud's temporal perspective here. While Freud seems to be explaining these religious traditions by appealing to past events, the nature of this historical truth he's constructing is actually based on our current understanding of the human psyche through psychoanalysis.
So he's kind of projecting backwards, using present-day psychological knowledge to interpret events from the distant past.
Exactly. And this is where his famous formula, the early trauma defense latency outbreak of neurosis, partial return of the repressed, comes in. It becomes his framework for reading religious prehistory, even though it's based on his psychoanalytic observations rather than hard historical evidence.
It's almost as if he's saying that the past itself is shaped by our present understanding of it.
It's a pretty radical idea when you think about it. And this brings us to Freud's connection to Christianity. He suggests that the murder of Moses wasn't directly remembered by the Israelites, but instead got replaced by this fantasy of atonement.
This idea of a sinless son of God, a kind of Moses figure, being killed and taking on the guilt of everyone else.
Right. And Freud sees the influence of Eastern and Greek mystery religions on this redemption narrative, with Paul the Apostle, who spread Christianity, playing a crucial role.
And what did Freud think about Paul?
He saw him as deeply religious, but also deeply influenced by these unconscious traces of the past, those memory traces we talked about earlier.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. What else does Bernstein highlight in Freud's work?
Well, he discusses how Freud sees religion, starting with the prohibition of images, evolving into a system of instinctual renunciations, particularly in the realm of sexuality.
So God becomes detached from sexuality and elevated to this realm of ethical perfection, with ethics being seen as the limitation of instinct. It's almost like civilization requires us to suppress our natural instincts.
Right. And the prophets, in Freud's view, play a key role in upholding these ethical demands of Mosaic monotheism. They become the guardians of morality.
Okay, so we're nearing the end of our deep dive into Bernstein. But before we move on to Assmann, there's one more crucial topic Bernstein addresses: psychoanalysis and Jewish identity.
Right. He directly refutes Peter Gay's argument that psychoanalysis isn't a Jewish science and that Freud never believed it was. While Freud strongly believed in the universal validity of psychoanalysis, aligning himself with the Enlightenment tradition, Bernstein argues that Freud's concept of Fortschritt in der Geistigkeit, the advance in intellectuality in the Moses study, actually links psychoanalysis directly to Jewish intellectual tradition.
Okay, unpack that a bit for me.
Remember, Freud argued that the prohibition against images led to increased intellectuality and self-esteem among Jewish people. This focus on abstract thought, on ideas rather than physical representations, was crucial for their survival, especially in exile.
And Bernstein suggests that Freud saw psychoanalysis as fitting within this intellectual lineage.
Exactly. He even quotes Anna Freud, who viewed the label Jewish science as a badge of honor, not a criticism. So while Freud was committed to the scientific rigor of psychoanalysis, he also recognized its connection to this unique intellectual tradition that Moses, in his interpretation, had initiated.
I see. So it's both universal and uniquely Jewish in a way.
It's a subtle but important distinction.
Bernstein also touches on the themes of hope and hopelessness, particularly in relation to Jewish tradition.
While Jewish tradition is generally characterized by an unwavering belief in hope, even in the face of suffering, some scholars have interpreted Freud's eternal return cycle, the idea that history repeats itself, as evidence of a deep-seated hopelessness.
An almost nihilistic view of human history, where we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again.
Right, but Bernstein argues that this interpretation completely misses the main point of Freud's book.
Okay, so what did Freud really mean then?
He wasn't emphasizing despair. He was highlighting the return of the repressed, this idea that even though the Semitic tribe that inherited the Moses tradition may have corrupted it over time, those noble elements from the original monotheism, the ethical core, would periodically resurface.
So it's not a cycle of doom, but a cycle of struggle and potential renewal.
Exactly. And he stresses that these historical or psychical truths, those unconscious memories of the past, actually exert real power, even when they're hidden beneath the surface.
It's a powerful image. Okay, anything else from Bernstein before we move on?
Yes, Bernstein also revisits the relationship between Moses and Akhenaten, pointing out that more recent scholarship has questioned the extent to which Akhenaten was truly a monotheist.
So the historical evidence might be more complex than Freud initially assumed.
It often is. And Bernstein also brings in the work of Carl Abraham, an earlier psychoanalyst who had also written about Akhenaten. Interestingly, Abraham's work actually anticipated many of Freud's claims about Akhenaten, like the idea of a spiritual revolution, the emphasis on Aten as the life-giving power, and the aniconic nature of the Aten religion.
So they were on the same page in some ways.
Definitely. But there were key differences, too. For example, Abraham suggested that Queen Tai, Akhenaten's mother, was the primary influence on his religious beliefs, and he didn't connect Moses directly to Akhenaten's followers.
Right. So while there's overlap in their interpretations, there are nuances and disagreements as well.
Absolutely. That's what makes these discussions so rich and interesting.
Okay, I think we've covered the key points from Bernstein's book. Anything else you want to add before we shift gears to Assmann's perspective?
Just one more thing. Bernstein discusses Freud's concept of acting out in therapy, where patients unconsciously repeat forgotten material through their actions. He then points out how fruitful it can be to apply these psychoanalytic concepts to broader cultural phenomena, like collective memory and forgetting. It's particularly relevant when we consider the aftermath of traumatic events, like the Holocaust.
And what about Freud's awareness of potentially hurting Jewish sensitivities with his book? Did Bernstein address that?
He did. Bernstein mentions Freud's inability to read Hebrew and his hope for a Hebrew translation of the book, which suggests he wanted it to be accessible to Jewish readers. But he also acknowledges that Freud was aware of the potentially sensitive nature of subjecting this important figure, Moses, to scientific inquiry.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Trying to be objective and analytical, while also being respectful of deeply held beliefs.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's now shift gears and explore how Jan Assmann, a cultural historian, approaches the figure of Moses the Egyptian.
All right, so Assmann kicks things off by challenging this seemingly obvious idea that distinguishing between true and false religion is just, a natural part of religion itself.
Like every religion just inherently sees itself as the right one and all others as wrong.
Right, and Assmann argues that this isn't simply ethnocentrism or just a way to feel superior to other groups. He suggests that the Mosaic distinction was something radically new. It didn't just differentiate between different religions, it created what he calls a counter-religion.
A religion that actively rejects everything before it, everything outside of it, as false and even dangerous.
Exactly. And this is a huge shift from earlier views. Assmann points out that in earlier polytheistic religions, what he calls cosmotheism, there was this idea of intercultural translation.
What does that mean?
Well, in cosmotheism, different cultures could look at each other's gods and see them as different names for similar divine powers, different aspects of a shared divine reality. There was room for mutual understanding, even a sense of unity.
Ah, so everyone's worshiping the same ultimate reality, just in different ways.
Right. But with the emergence of monotheism, particularly the kind attributed to Moses, there's this sharp division. It becomes a zero-sum game. Our God is the only God, and all others are false idols.
Okay, so it's a profound shift in how different religions relate to each other. And how does this play out in Assmann's understanding of history and what he calls mnemohistory?
Assmann argues that this mosaic distinction had a profound impact on how we remember and interpret history. He suggests that historical reality, in our collective memory, gets simplified down to this dichotomy of Israel representing truth and Egypt representing darkness and error.
So Egypt becomes this kind of inverted image of Israel.
Exactly. It's stripped of its complexity and turned into a symbol of everything Israel had to overcome. Assmann even calls the Exodus myth a constellative myth, a tale of two countries, where the meaning is found in the tension between these two poles.
And he emphasizes that this construction of otherness, this defining of us versus them, can't just be reduced to specific historical events from the late Bronze Age.
Right. It's much more about how those events were later remembered and woven into cultural narratives.
Okay, I'm following you. Now, Assmann also engages with Martin Bernal's Black Athena. What's that about?
Ah, yes. Bernal argued that the pro-Greek movement in German Romanticism, the kind that idolized ancient Greece, was actually tied to anti-Jewish and anti-Egyptian sentiments. He suggested that this bias shaped how they viewed both Greece and Germany.
Okay, and what's Assmann's take on that?
Assmann agrees that Bernal's observations about the biases of these later interpretations are valid. But he critiques Bernal for taking the ancient model of Greece at face value, as if it were historically accurate, while simultaneously recognizing the distortions in later reconstructions.
So he's saying Bernal's being a bit inconsistent.
Exactly. And this leads to a crucial point that Assmann makes. We need to be careful about trying to prove historical truth within mnemohistory. He's not saying we shouldn't study the past, but we need to be mindful that cultural memory always shapes our understanding of history, often in ways we don't even realize.
I see. So it's more about understanding how we remember than about uncovering the objective truth of the past.
Right. And that's what mnemohistory is all about. It's the study of cultural memory, drawing on the Greek concept of mnemosyne, the mother of the muses. Culture itself, Assmann argues, is a form of memory.
Okay, so mnemohistory focuses on cultural memory as a way of understanding how we construct meaning and identity. But Assmann says his specific interest lies in discourse history. What's the difference?
Well, he's particularly interested in the Wanderstrasse, the wandering path of cultural memory. He's not just looking at memory in general, but at how specific discourses, specific ways of talking about and representing something evolve over time.
So instead of just looking at the big picture, he's zooming in on specific conversations, so to speak.
Exactly. And in the case of Moses the Egyptian, he traces how different discourses on Egypt, those from classical sources, hieroglyphic texts, and the Bible eventually merged, leading to this peak of Egyptomania in the late 18th century.
Ah, yes, that fascination with all things Egyptian. Think Mozart's Magic Flute with its Egyptian themes, or Napoleon's expedition to Egypt.
Precisely. And it's fascinating how these seemingly disparate strands of knowledge about Egypt eventually came together to shape European perceptions of Egypt.
Right. Now, when discussing Moses the Egyptian, Assmann uses the term Egyptian in a broad sense. What does he mean by that?
He's not just talking about ethnic identity, but also about cultural identity. He points out how various historical figures ranging from Manetho, an Egyptian priest and historian, to Strabo, a Greek geographer, to John Toland, an Irish philosopher, and of course Freud, all viewed Moses as either ethnically or culturally Egyptian.
So some saw him as literally being born in Egypt, while others saw him as a Hebrew who was deeply immersed in Egyptian culture and thought.
Exactly. And then there were others, like John Spencer, William Warburton, Carl Leonhard Reinhold, and even Friedrich Schiller, who viewed Moses as Hebrew but influenced by Egyptian wisdom.
It's remarkable how this idea of Moses having some connection to Egypt has persisted across time and cultures.
Absolutely. And as an Egyptologist, Assmann sees his unique contribution as being able to trace the original impetus for this discourse, for this idea of Moses the Egyptian. He wants to understand how it began and how it transformed over time.
And he also emphasizes that mnemohistory needs historical reflection, just as Egyptology needs mnemohistorical awareness. What does he mean by that?
He's saying that we can't truly understand cultural memory without also understanding the historical context in which those memories were formed. And conversely, when studying history, we need to be mindful of how cultural memory shapes our interpretations.
So it's a two-way street. Our understanding of history shapes our memory, and our memory shapes our understanding of history.
Exactly. Okay, so let's delve deeper into Assmann's exploration of Moses the Egyptian. He pinpoints Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution in Egypt, which occurred in the 14th century BCE, as the first recorded instance of conflict between fundamentally different, mutually exclusive religious systems within a single society.
So this wasn't just a difference in beliefs. It was a clash between two worldviews that couldn't coexist peacefully.
Right. And Akhenaten's revolution, with its radical rejection of traditional Egyptian religion and its often violent intolerance, had all the hallmarks of what Assmann calls a counter-religion.
What's interesting is that Akhenaten's transformation of Egypt's cultural and religious landscape was incredibly swift and imposed from the top down.
He didn't try to gradually win people over, he basically forced it on them. And while Assmann acknowledges that a full discussion of Akhenaten's theology is a topic for another time, he emphasizes the intense religious antagonism this must have generated.
Imagine having your entire worldview, your entire way of life, suddenly overturned by a ruler who declares that everything you've always believed in is wrong.
It must have been incredibly traumatic for the Egyptians of that time. And Assmann argues that this trauma is precisely what fueled the later reconstructions and reinterpretations of this period.
It's like the memory of that upheaval was so powerful that it couldn't be completely erased. Even when Akhenaten's revolution was officially suppressed, the traces remained.
Exactly. And drawing on Aleida Assmann's work on memory, he suggests that trauma can actually stabilize memory, making it more vivid and enduring even when other memories fade.
It's a fascinating paradox. Trauma can be destructive, but it can also solidify certain memories, making them resistant to forgetting.
Right. Okay, so moving on, Assmann then examines Tacitus's summary of the Exodus tradition, which actually blends together several different accounts.
Remind me what Tacitus says.
Well, he mentions an epidemic in Egypt, an oracle that called for the expulsion of a group detested by the gods, and then Moses leading this group out of Egypt and into Palestine, where he established Jerusalem and instituted a religion that was, in Tacitus's words, the opposite of all others.
Ah, yes, the idea of normative inversion, where one group defines itself in direct opposition to another group. If Group A values X, Group B will emphasize not X, even if that wasn't originally a defining characteristic. It's a powerful way of establishing a distinct identity.
Exactly. And Tacitus points out how the monotheistic and aniconic nature of the Jewish God contrasted sharply with Egyptian animal worship.
Right, and Tacitus even mentions the sacrifice of a donkey and a ram, which was likely meant to mock Egyptian deities, highlighting how Jews considered sacred what Egyptians deemed profane.